Hello everyone, welcome back. This is Macroeconomics. So in the previous videos, we already learned about how we derived the income expenditure model. So we talk about how we came up with the macroeconomic equilibriums, where the planned aggregate expenditure is equal to the aggregate incomes, or the aggregate outputs instead. So today what we're going to do is to jump from the previous model and moving to a more sophisticated models that can explain not only just the output of the economy, but also explains the unemployment and also inflations in the economy. And this model is called the aggregate demands, aggregate supply models. So in this lecture, we are going to go over the concept of aggregate demands, the aggregate supplies, and the shifting factors of the both. And we are going to also define what we mean by a short-run equilibriums in this model and the long-run equilibriums. Well, in the next videos, we're also going to talk about how the economic shocks will affect the equilibriums and how we move from a long-run equilibrium being shocked and towards a short-run equilibrium where most of the time the economy will cause a problems. Well, in the previous lecture, we talked about the income expenditure model, and we built the simplest model by the assumptions of no government, closed economy, and fixed price level and interest rates. And today, what we want to do is to relax all these assumptions to make it a more complete model. And we would like you to use this complete model to explain the aggregate demands in our economy. So first of all, we would like to take out the government restrictions and also the closed economy restrictions. Well, if we go back to our original models, we assume only the firms and the households exist in the economy. So we have the aggregate expenditure functions equal to C plus I. Now, if we are going to put the governments into our models, we have to start realizing what the government is trying to do in our economy. So first of all, we define the roles of the government in this model. The government will take tax away from the households, and also the government will spend money in the economy by the government purchase. So when we actually have a government taking tax from our income, which is Y, and now we can assume that Y is going to be affected. And also the government purchase will add on to the aggregate expenditures in our functions. Also, in the open economy case, we will be adding the two expenses into our economy. Well, one is the total amount of imports, which is the money that we spend on buying the goods from outside world, and the total amount of exports, which we also define as a capital inflows, which is the foreign money goes into the domestic market to buy our goods. Now let's take a look at how adding the government and open economy will affect our original models. Since our incomes will be deducted by the total tax amount T, so now when we're looking at the model here, we are no longer evaluating at Y, which is the total national income, but instead we are going to change the x-axis to YD, which is what we mean by disposable income, or sometimes people call this tax or income after tax. The government will add purchases in the economy, and those expenditure will increase the total level of outputs. And in this case, it's almost like adding an additional autonomous expenditure in the economy. However, as we all know, the government making a purchase will not be considering how much tax they are getting, or maybe how much disposable incomes that the households made in the economy. So that's why this government purchase is a autonomous spending, just like the investment spending we defined earlier. Government spending has nothing to do with the income level earned in the populations. So we basically adding on top of our original model here, as long as we have this autonomous expenditure add on to our equations, we are literally just shifting the graph up. Now, adding the open economy, we know the import and export figure can be added to our equations very easily, because whatever money that we spend on imports, it's basically the money that's floating out the country. And whatever the amounts of exports, it's basically the money floating into the country. So the net of the two, we call this a net export. So we are using the total amounts of exports minus the total amounts of imports, and we'll get the net exports figures. And again, the net export is assumed to be autonomous spending in the economy. It's very difficult for you to imagine. If we have higher level of incomes, we are going to either buy or sell goods to the outside world, or from the outside world more or less. So that's why we believe the net export is again independent from our national income, Y, or disposable income, YD. So that's why adding the net exports into the equations, basically just adding an additional autonomous expenditures, just like how we previously did. So now we have a full model. The planned aggregate expenditure function, it's now C plus I plus G plus NX, which include the households, the firms, the governments, and the international world. So now the question is, we are not only just allowing the governments to come in and also the international world to get into our models. We are also relaxing the last assumption here. We are also allowing prices to change. So we are asking the questions, what if the overall prices in the economy actually goes up? So in another word, what if the economy is facing an inflation? Well, when the overall prices goes up, I would imagine the following things will happen. Number one, the real values of the household's wealth will decrease. So that means the dollar that you hold in your pockets, it's going to worth less. Because everything is getting more expensive, the $1 can only buy you less goods and services comparing to the past. And in this case, we call this a wealth effect. So as long as the households is feeling they're getting hit by these inflations, they can no longer buy the same amounts of goods by earning the same amounts of income, well, they will decide to cut back on their consumptions. And number two, when people actually facing a high inflations or just a inflations in the economy, and obviously they will need to have more cash in order to buy goods and services that's more expensive in the current periods comparing to the past. So the demand for money will increase. Well, when people demanding more cash or demanding more money to use to buy goods and services in the economy, it drives up the interest rate. The interest rate goes up will definitely affect the firms and businesses in the economy, because firms and businesses will spend money on investments based on the interest rates given in the economy. Whenever the interest rate goes up, well, it will negatively affect the investment spending in the economy, and we call this interest rate effect. Also, when the inflation goes up in the economy, the domestic economy, that means it's more expensive to buy in our country comparing to other countries that has no inflations assumed to be. It's more likely that we're going to buy goods from the foreign country, so we will import more, and also it's going to cost the foreign country to buy less from us because we are more expensive for the foreign country to buy the goods. So people living in a foreign country, they will buy less of our domestic products, and that's why it leads to decrease in exports. So when exports decrease and imports increase, and that will cause the net exports to fall. So generally speaking, what we're seeing here is when we have a price levels increase in the economy, let's suppose we begin with the low price level in this graph. When the overall prices increase, it would decrease the consumptions, decrease the investment spending, and also decrease the net export spending in the economy. And that's why the overall aggregate expenditure functions will shift down because of this decrease in autonomous spending in the economy. And as you see in the graph, the equilibrium outputs will change from Y2 to Y1. So generally speaking, what we're seeing here is the aggregate outputs in the income expenditure models will shift when there is a change of price level in the economy. When the prices goes up, the aggregate outputs in our income expenditure models will decrease. And of course, vice versa, when the overall price levels actually decrease, we are going to expect to aggregate outputs to increase. So in order to rationalize this relationship, we plot the two variables, prices and outputs, into the same axis like the following. And here, what we're seeing here in the graph, it's basically a lines that speaking of the relationship between aggregate price levels and the aggregate outputs. Or in this case, because the AD curve here that we plot out, it's coming from the income expenditure model. So we basically say that it's the relationship between the overall price levels to the aggregate expenditure in the economy. The higher the price level is, the lower the aggregate expenditure will be in the economy. The lower the price level, the higher the aggregate expenditures in the economy will be. So this downward sloping demand, aggregate demand curve, basically speaking out of all the possible macroeconomic equilibrium that we derive in the income expenditure models. So now let's suppose we get some idea about how the aggregate demand is being plotted out from the income expenditure models. We would like to investigate, what if the economy is now going into a recession? The sales of the companies at your work is declining, and your boss has to make a decision to cut on those prices of their products. At some point, you will ask to meet with your boss and discuss your wages for the next year. Is the owner of the business likely to cut your pay? So we would like to answer this series of questions by looking into this new model called the aggregate demand, aggregate supply models. So in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply models, we're going to expect to see a very similar graph as we had in chapter 3, which is the demand and supply models for a market setting. However, the two defined here are very different to what we study in the supply and demand models for a market setting. Again, the aggregate demands basically describe the relationships between the price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded by the household firms, governments, and the international world. On the other hand, the aggregate supply basically explains the relationship between the price levels and the quantity of the real GDP being supplied by the firms in the economy. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, it's very different to the microeconomics foundation model, the supply and demand models. The reasons being is, number one, the supply demand model only study the supply and demand for one single market, one goods in the economy. It does not have the capability to track down the whole economy activities. Also, when you look carefully in this ADAS models, graphically, we are plotting the aggregate demand and aggregate supply into these two axes. The vertical axis, it's not the price of the goods, but instead is the overall price index in the whole economy. So this price index is not the price for a single goods. It is an index number that explains the overall price, all the goods combined in the economy. And if we look at the horizontal axis, this graph basically have an horizontal axis that describes the aggregate outputs in the economy. Again, the total values of goods and services combined in the economy. It's not in terms of quantity of the goods. So that's why the measures of these models, or the scales that we use in these models, it's very different to the one that we study in the supply and demand models for single markets. Well, I would call this the worst naming fashions in the economic history, because obviously we have a very similar name, very similar shapes of the graphs that we evaluate in this model comparing to the supply and demand models in a single market case. But keep in mind, those two cannot be confused and should not be confused in the context of this study. Now, again, let's review what we just talked about on the aggregate demand side. So in the income expenditure models, we expand our study by allowing or relaxing the fixed price assumptions so that the model can have the prices to change. And as we study, when the prices change, the equilibrium outputs in our model will also change. And this aggregate demand curve basically is describing every single possible macroeconomic equilibriums in the income expenditure models with various of price levels. So we will always be on the AD curve in the economy. The reason is because there's always never a case where we will be deviate from the macroeconomic equilibriums in the income expenditure model that we study. We have proven that there is a convergency in the income expenditure model. There is an equilibrium that we always land on. So that's why with a given price levels in the economy, we should land on either one of the points on this AD curve. Now the question is, which point are we going to end up to be? So that's why we need some additional piece of information in this model for us to find out, well, which point on the AD curve we will be landing on in this economy, or which output level we should be producing. Again, the behavior of the aggregate demand curve can be described by the following three effects. Number one, wealth effects. When the average prices or the overall price level increase, the real values of cash or money will decrease. The purchasing power of the money will decrease also. And at the end, what happens is we will have the consumptions to decrease. Interest rate effects. When the demand for money to buy goods and services increase, we have less in saving. So in the loanable funds, when the supply of loanable funds decrease, it drives up the interest rates. When the interest rate goes up, unfortunately, the total investment spending in the economy will also decrease because the cost for borrowing money to invest is high. And at the end, we call this international trade effect. When the overall price level increase in the domestic markets, it drives up the price for buying goods in the domestic markets, and people living in the country will more likely to buy an imported goods because it's cheaper. And also for foreigners, they are less likely going to buy the goods produced domestically in our country because, well, they will feel like, well, they should buy the goods in their own country instead of importing from our country. So our exports will decrease. So the overall net exports will decrease because of the rise of prices. So keep in mind, we don't actually just plot the AD curve because it behaves like a demand we study in the supply-demand models. We actually plot the AD curve, downward sloping AD curve, because of the reasonings of these three different macroeconomic effects. So now let's talk about the shifters of the aggregate demand. So we can have the economy producing at different level of outputs when the overall price level change. However, it is also possible for the aggregate demand curve to shift in our economy. Well, number one reasons that actually have the aggregate demand shift in our economy is by the government policies. There are two main policies that can shift the aggregate demand curve in our economy. One is called the monetary policy, and the other one is called the fiscal policy. And we are going to study both in the later chapters. But the general idea is when the government is using a policy to shift the aggregate demand curve, we literally imagines the government is basically using the policy tool to affect the aggregate consumptions or aggregate expenditures in the economy. Well, another way to think about the shift of the aggregate demand curve is by the change of expectations of the households and firms. So when the households has a different expectations about their future income, let's say they have decided to save more money and spend less money today, the consumption level will decrease, and that will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left or decrease the aggregate demands in the economy. Or when firms facing a future probability of investment spending, if they have a more profitable investments in the future, they are more likely to borrow money to invest in the economy for the future productions. However, if there is a decrease in future probabilities of the investment spending in the economy, firms feel like, well, they are not going to make much of a profit by spending money to invest today. The investment spending in the economy will drop, and that will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So again, the shift of the aggregate demand curve represents whether the economy is having a higher level of spending or a lower level of spending. Whenever there is a decrease in autonomous expenditures in the economy, the aggregate demand curve will shift leftward, or we call this decrease in aggregate demands. And whenever we have the autonomous expenditure increase, and that will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, which is increase in aggregate demands. And number three, by any foreign variable change, in an open economy setting, when the real incomes increase faster than other countries, imports will usually increase and export will usually decrease. And in this case, there will be a decrease in net exports. And that's why there will be a leftward shift in the aggregate demands. And also, exchange rate play a big role. When the exchange rate increase, most of the times the imports of a country will increase. We will buy more from the other country, and we're going to export less. So the export will decrease, and again, net export in this case will decrease. So the aggregate demand curve will actually shift to the left when the exchange rate increase in the domestic country. So those are the variables that is going to shift the aggregate demand curve, but the overall idea is whenever the autonomous expenditure increase in the economy, the aggregate demand will shift right. And whenever the aggregate expenditures decrease, the aggregate demands will shift to the left, which is decrease in aggregate demands. Now it's time to study the aggregate supplies. So the aggregate supply basically shows the effect of how the change in price levels on the quantity of goods and services that the firms are willing to or able to supply in the economy. The effect of change in price levels on aggregate supplies is very different in the short runs as compared to its long runs. So we're going to start thinking about the long run aggregate supplies in the economy and what does it mean. And then we'll move on to the short run aggregate supplies and try to study the short run's behavior of the aggregate supplies in the economy. So in the long run aggregate supply case, we basically assume that the country will have a certain amount of outputs that we can possibly produce with all the given resources used in the economy. And whenever the price level change, the potential outputs of the country will not be affected. So that's why we are plotting out the long run aggregate supplies with these vertical lines. to indicate there is certain amounts of outputs that a country can produce. Even when prices change, it won't affect it. Well, this long-run aggregate supply, it's basically pointing at what we call a potential GDP in a country, or sometimes we call this a full employment GDP of a country. So the idea is, in the long run, there is a certain amount of outputs that we can produce in a country, and that amount of output is assumed when everyone's in the economy, it's basically working in our economy in the normal hours. And of course, we call this a full employment GDP. It's not because we're assuming unemployment is equal to 0. We still assume that there are some natural rate of unemployment, which is the sum of structural and frictional unemployment in the economy. So once the country actually produces at long-run aggregate supplies, pointing at that level of outputs, we know that people are basically working at a normal hour. No one is getting unemployed because of the conditions of the economy. However, in the short runs, the aggregate supplies or the supply in the economy will change with the overall prices. Well, one easy way to think about this shape of the aggregate supply curve in the short runs is to imagine there is certain limits that we can use our resources in the world. When the economy is start producing more and more, at some point we are going to use up all our production inputs or resources in the economy. And when we start producing more and more, there is upward pressures on prices for all the production inputs, including labors, natural resources, lands, and all the other things like capital, equipment, and tools. When the overall costs increase in the productions because, well, people are producing too much in the economy, ultimately this increasing cost will reflect it in the overall price level. So as the economy starts producing more and more and more, the overall price level will also be increasing because of the overall cost increased. And that could be one easy way to explain the behavior of the short-run aggregate supplies, where it's meeting the closer that the outputs it's reaching to this limits, which is the green dotted lines in the graph, the higher the prices that the firms will have to charge in the economy. Well, another way to explain the upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve is to think about the case that we began with this chapter. So there are two main reasons why the short-run aggregate supply curve could be upward sloping. And think about when the economy is facing some changes. Let's say when the overall prices it's actually increasing, and you are one of the businesses in the economy. When you are basically increasing, when you're seeing the increase in overall prices, your competitors are all charging more in the economy. And you are basically given the signals that you can also charge more. So you can charge more on your final goods and services in the economy, and at the same time, you can actually not pay more for your production inputs, let's say for your labor. Well, when the overall prices increase, when firms start to charge more in the economy, adjusting to this inflation, and knowing that they are going to take advantage of the labor and not paying them more, obviously the overall profit level will increase, and that will attract firms and businesses to actually supply more goods and services. Well, another way to think about this upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve is when the overall price level increase, and let's say, again, you're one of the businesses in the economy. Let's say you see your competitor rising the prices, and you decided this time you don't want to raise your prices. Let's say you keep the same price, and you're selling the products in the economy comparing to your competitor, which is cheaper. And in this case, because you're raising your price so slow, and the consumers in the economy will realize you are the one who's charging the lowest price, and they will all buying from you. And at the end of the day, what happens is you're going to see an increase in sales in your business. And end up, what happens is you are going to increase your productions, and you will start producing more to satisfy this increase in sales of your business. So either one way or the other, I think it's pretty clear why the short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. Well, now the thing is, in these two cases, there are some very similar situations that could happen in the economy. You can see that either firms adjusting the prices very slowly, or maybe the wages actually adjust very slowly to the change of prices in the economy. So why firms adjust the prices slowly? Well, there are several reasons to answer this. Number one, maybe the firm signed on a contract. Maybe a contract to the workers where wages is fixed so that they can take advantage of the workers. Or maybe the contract for setting the price to sell in the markets, which make both wages and prices could be sticky at the same time. Well, another reason is firms are often slowly adjust the wages of the workers, which you can imagine. If it's not for minimum wage to change, most of the times the firms and businesses will not adjust the minimum wage workers' wages easily. And number three, the prices are adjusted slowly in the economy, maybe because what we studied in the previous chapters, the manual cost, it's very high for a firm to constantly adjusting the prices in the economy. So when inflation happens, firms sometimes will feel like, well, they rather charge the same price because it's causing them more to change the prices very often. Well, there are some evidence here. So in the economy that we settle in, we always see the data that's showing the sticky wages and sticky prices. And in this graph, we obviously see what happened in 2008. So in 2008, when our economy jumped into a great recession, we're actually seeing more workers keeping the same wages as comparing to the previous levels. So when the nominal wage actually frozen during the recessions, well, in this case, what happened is the people earning the same wages, they are getting the real wages fall because of inflations. And also, wages cuts upset workers, and at the end, it might possibly lower the productivities of the workers too. So the sticky wages, it's basically one of the key assumptions for us to study the short runs business cycles in the aggregate supply sides. So we have to always keep in mind. Now we have the aggregate supplies in the short runs and the long run explained. Let's very quickly go over the shifters of the aggregate supplies. So generally speaking, anything that changed the productions in the economy will always affect the aggregate supplies in the economy. So for instance, any increase in labor force or capital stocks in the economy, increase in labor force and capital stock will shift the aggregate supply curve to the right or increase in aggregate supplies. Technological improvements will also shift the aggregate supply to the right. Any expected change in future prices will also shift the aggregate supplies. Adjustments for workers and firms to the error in the past expectations about the price level will also change the supplies or aggregate supplies in the current states. Unexpected change in prices of the natural resources will also change the overall productions in the economy. So generally speaking, we can now combine the short-run aggregate supplies and the aggregate demand that we derive from the income expenditure models. And we can now find this one equilibrium point where the two lines cross each other. So the rationality is when the economy is producing a level where the level of output is too low, when the overall prices is so high, that indicates the aggregate demand will be very, very slow. And at the same time, the aggregate supplies will be at the very low level of price levels. The gap between the two right here will have a pressures of the economy to slowly adjust. So again, this graph right here basically demonstrates when people are decided to buy goods at this high price level, at this level of outputs, and the firm is willing to sell this overall outputs at a very low price levels. And people start realizing they can actually get more because the firms are only willing to charge very little in the economy. And there will be a pressure to keep pushing the aggregate outputs to a higher levels. On the other hand, if we have a level of outputs that's standing so high, and the economy will have the aggregate demands pointing at this level of outputs, that indicates people are willing to pay only very, very low prices for the overall goods, but the firms require to pay a very high prices or cost to produce them. And there will be adjustments here where the aggregate output will decrease. So at some point, obviously, we will be forced to this one point, which is the equilibriums of this model. And this time, we are calling this equilibrium a short-run equilibriums outputs in the economy. Well, we call this a short-run equilibrium because, well, we only evolve with the short-run aggregate supplies in this picture right here. In order to evaluate the long-run equilibriums outputs, we have to actually add the long-run aggregate supplies into the graph. So when is the economy going to reach to the long-run aggregate outputs? It's when the short-run aggregate equilibriums is equals to the long-run aggregate supplies outputs, or the potential outputs. So this is the graph that demonstrates that the economy is reaching to these long-run equilibriums, where the economy will have no tendency to make changes. And again, with this graph, hopefully you can now understand why the aggregate demand and supply models is such an important and powerful model. Because this model not only indicates the level of outputs to produce. In the short run, we're going to have the economy produce $15 trillion of goods and services in the economy. And this model also pointing at the overall price levels in the economy will be 120. And more importantly, because we are producing the level of outputs, $15 trillion worth of goods and services, right at the long-run aggregate supply curve pointing at, which is the potential outputs or the full employment outputs in the economy. And obviously, the employments in the economy, it's basically reaching to the optimals. There is no additional unemployment is being created at this stage of the economy. So this is the equilibrium, not only showing us the level of outputs produced in the economy, but also demonstrates the level of price levels and the level of unemployment in the economy. So at this point, hopefully you're now getting an idea of how we construct the aggregate supply and aggregate demand models and how we come up with the short-run equilibriums and the long-run equilibriums. In the next videos, we are going to start evaluating the gaps of the economic outputs comparing to the long runs, and how we calculate the equilibrium outputs gaps through the models. And of course, the most important things that we're going to study next is how the economic shocks will affect the economy from the long-run equilibriums to a short-run equilibriums and causing a recessions. So I will see you guys next videos. Hope you enjoy this.